Hello, I'm Dan Gibson.
I'm Chad Dole.
And this is the second video that we're doing on the table of contents in the book, Let the Stone Speak. And so, Chad, we got up to chapter 8 last time. Let's start in chapter 9, and let's talk about the religion of Abraham. And why do you think this chapter is important? Why do we put it here?
Yeah, I remember as we were developing this argument became more and more important to you, and we're going to kind of take a step back to the beginning of things to do some of the conceptual work around Islam, because you didn't develop, but you noticed this whole concept of the Hanafiya as something very key to early Islam and a motivating factor that gives us a lot of context for everything which comes next. So can you explain what Hanafiya is?
Yeah, it's very important, and I think for many of the revisionists or people leaning in that direction, maybe the lights will go on as we work our way through this chapter. But before Muhammad was even started his prophethood, there were people who were searching for the religion of Abraham, and that was a very important thing to them. They were from a polytheistic background. Petra was full of temples to all the different gods. And so these people are there, but they get captivated with the ancient religion of Abraham. And the reason for this is that there was this altar sitting right in the middle of the city, in the most important spot. Not just an altar, probably quite big. I mean, it's like 10 feet by, maybe 10 feet by 14 feet, something like that. Big altar sitting there with some stairs going up to it. And everyone was told, this is the altar of Abraham. Abraham built this altar with Ishmael and with Ishmael's mother, Hagar. And so they have this idea. Now, which Mecca we've talked about before, this story is in. I believe it's in Petra. That's where the altar was. And there's descriptions of where it was, and we will have looked at that in the past, and you can read all those different arguments. But these people were fascinated by the fact that this was Abraham's altar, and we should be following the religion of Abraham. Problem was, the religion of Abraham had been lost. And so some of these men went out to begin to seek, and they're talking about seeking the Hanafiya. Hanafiya means the turning away from paganism to monotheism, and Abraham did that. He lived in a pagan setting. He turned to monotheism. So this is the religion of Abraham, turning to monotheism. And they began to search that. And this story is written all the way back in Ibn Hisham. He's got the story there. And you can read about these four men and how they went out and searched for this. And it's interesting, none of them became Jews, but some of them became Christians in this search. But that whole search was behind this. Later on, when someone asked Muhammad, what is this new religion you're bringing? He said, it's the religion of the Hanafiya, the religion of Abraham. And so that really struck me. Okay, this is that turning from paganism over to worshiping one true God. And so he identified it as Hanafiya. And we find that word Hanafiya appearing in the earliest descriptions of what Muhammad was teaching. Muhammad does not use the word Islam, and the word Islam doesn't come till later. And there's a parallel with the Christians in that as well, is that it wasn't started out as being called Christianity, it was called the Way. And it didn't switch until off in Antioch, where people started being called Christians, and then it just began to be used more and more and became the popular term for Christians. So if you go to the Bible, I mean, any early manuscripts, and you're looking for, that doesn't mention Christian here, but if it talks of the Way, you identify, well, that was the early name. Same thing happened in Islam. It was not Islam from the beginning, it was Hanafiya, and that switch to Islam came later.
So was that a conceptual change when it switched to Islam, more than just a name change?
Well, that's an interesting thing. Where and when, we don't have a clear record like we do in the Bible. The New Testament says exactly what city and what time period that name changed for Christians. But in Islam, it's just sort of blurs from one into the other.
Right, it was a natural process.
Maybe, but there was a move of some point. And I think when we go back and look at Hajjaj and what he was doing in working on sort of branding Islam. His rebranding of Islam was important because before that they were out trying to reach pagan people and get them to turn to be monotheists. Eventually, the religion had covered all of Arabia, and that's where the polytheists were. And now they were confronted with the biggest push was against Christians. And so the switch happened about that time. Exactly where and when, we can't nail it down. I think Hajjaj had a lot to do with it. But now Islam comes forward, and it's no longer talking about the Hanafiya moving from polytheism to monotheism. Now it's talking about submission. Islam means submission, and that's the face that's put onto this religion. And now everybody knows it as Islam, but originally it was known as Hanafiya. So there's quite the thing that's there.
So another of the things we do in this chapter on the religion of Abraham, chapter 9, is we transition then into if the outset of this religion was about restoring the religion of Abraham, we hone in then on the pilgrimage, because the pilgrimage in Islam has been closely associated with Abraham, hasn't it?
That's right. There's some parts there that even say, yes, Abraham, at the end of the pilgrimage, they give this shout or whatever, and they say this is exactly what Abraham did. They're trying to recreate. Abraham faced the altar. Abraham at one point walked around the altar, so now everybody walks around the altar. Are there things that they're trying to remember? And whether they truly remember, or whether it's just sort of some things that have common knowledge has come down and maybe it's changed over time, we don't know for sure. But when Muhammad was revealing this religion to people, he specifically laid out the steps of the pilgrimage and said this is what Abraham did.
So then we seek to answer the obvious question: if Islam was about restoring the religion of Abraham, it was called the Hanafiya, the pilgrimage was core to it, can we fit the pilgrimage into Petra? Because if it doesn't fit, then we've lost a core element. And when you try to step by step walk people through Petra on the pilgrimage, as you do in the book, what have you found? Anything compelling?
Well, it's interesting because I did the measurements. So in Mecca, when you walk a certain distance each day, and you do things at different places. And I put those over onto Petra, and they start with where you wash, and you have to have a place of water or whatever. And there's two places there, just like described in the Quran, and where the men wash and where the women would wash. I mean, you can find those places that are there. You can follow the route down into the city, and it's easy because you've got a rough measurement. They walked roughly 3.5 kilometers, so you go 3.5 kilometers, and guess what? The whole thing fits. And we're able to put the pilgrimage that is in Mecca over onto Petra. But I think originally it was in Petra, and when the people moved to Mecca, they took the pilgrimage and placed it in Mecca that way around. So that's the way I see it. And then lastly, we look at just a little bit of the whole shape of the cube shape, and where did that come from? And as we go to Petra, we find cubes all over the place.
Right.
And so it's attached with Petra as well, and the religion of Abraham. Well, then we move on to chapter 10, and we look at two things. We're going to look at Hajjaj first, and then a group called the Karmatians. So take us off to Hajjaj. What did we find out?
Yeah, if you have been following our videos all the way through, you've seen Hajjaj sort of peppered about throughout this whole thing. He did this, he did that, he did that. And Dan has often been asked the question, even when this first started to come up, how could Hajjaj have such a profound influence on Islam? Most people thinking of the between Qibla, because we assign that to him as well. How could he have that kind of power? How could he have that kind of influence?
And surely people would have argued.
And they did. And what we explore in the first half of this chapter is the fact that Hajjaj truly was an enemy to the traditionalists. He persecuted the companions of the Prophet. He was known to be a tyrant. He was accused of killing over 1 million men by one historian. Even if that number is inflated, you get the picture of his character. And so he ruled with an iron fist, and he was able to make sweeping changes throughout the Arabic world, even politically, and that's indisputable.
The records are there about Hajjaj. And then we pick up these tidbits like Ibn Abu Dawood coming along saying, well, Hajjaj did more than just add the vowels onto Arabic. He actually changed the meaning of some of the words. And then we find other people talking about Hajjaj did this and Hajjaj did that. If you begin to bring them all together, you get quite a picture of this man who had the ability to make massive changes in Islam and influence it. Now, the people who argued against him were known as traditionalists, and you find this word traditionalists all the way through Islamic writing, and you find the word the reformers all the way through. We're not making this up. This is in Islamic writing, and historians have long argued a little bit about what were the traditionalists, what were the reformers. Once we look at archaeology, it really comes out. Okay, there were people in different camps, and they had different standing. Hajjaj is the guy who really put down the traditionalists and made people accept the Reformation, the reforms that he was doing. So the original reformers of Islam and who changed things goes back to Hajjaj. And he really was the power behind that.
And in the chapter, we even have references to traditionalists from the Islamic histories who were approaching Hajjaj and disputing with him and being persecuted from him. So the fact, this whole animosity with the traditionalists is well documented in Islamic history.
And they would argue, you've changed everything. And they said, well, the prayer hasn't changed. He said, no, you changed the prayers, the words in the prayers. Everything's been changed from what Muhammad taught us. So that's a challenge that we're left with. The question then comes, wouldn't there have been even a greater groundswell? But as Hajjaj suppressed the traditionalists, they sort of went underground. And another century goes by, but something's happening underground. There are what are called hidden imams. And these hidden imams come along and they start teaching people things that are not accepted by the majority, who are now the reformers. They don't use those words exactly. It's the hidden imams. And the hidden imams don't have anything to guide them. So they come up with all kinds of interesting things because they're seeking knowledge. They want to figure out, and they want to figure out what actually happened back then, and also how to bring in the philosophy of the Greeks and how to bring in, the teachings of the Zoroastrians and people around them. So they're looking at trying to understand all these things. A group comes along that comes out of this known as the Brethren of Purity. And the Brethren of Purity, they are very interested in true Islam. What is true Islam? Pure Islam. And they become known as the Karmatians. And they have a whole series of lessons that people take. There's 51 of these volumes of lessons that you got to work your way through in different stages. We describe all of that, but they become more and more powerful. At one point, they're able to field an army of 100,000 men. So that's a sizable army, and fight against the Caliph. So there was some real friction growing there. One of the things they did is they stopped people going onto the pilgrimage and saying, don't go to Mecca. And they just stopped people, sent them back. When people refused, they would kill them. And there was just, the whole Islamic world was getting into turmoil over these guys who are saying, no, this is the true Islam, or the pure Islam, and don't go to Mecca. And it just, that has really got people confused in the last century, trying to look and understand the Karmatians, because they don't have the whole Qibla story that's behind them.
Yeah, the Karmatians' animosity toward the pilgrimage extended to the point where they actually attacked Mecca. They looted the city, they killed pilgrims who were there, and the records say that they stuffed Zamzam well with bodies. It's how grotesque their attack was. And maybe one of the most profound things they did, other than attack the holy city, is they also took the black stone out of Mecca and took it back into their territory.
For 22 years.
For 22 years. And now, when I've read historians talk about this, they always want to say that the Karmatians were motivated by looting. They wanted wealth when they made all these attacks. Interestingly, they returned the loot that they took from Mecca back to the Meccans. And when they were sued, or when envoys were sent in order to try to ransom back the black stone. They refused, and they were offered substantial sums of money. And so Dan and I believe, and I think the history bears it out, that they were not financially motivated. They were theologically motivated. They had a problem with the pilgrimage itself.
We'll look at the Karmatians, the whole thing that they're trying to bring back Islam, but they have a problem. Just as back at the time of Muhammad, they were trying to bring back the religion of Abraham and struggled to what fits and what doesn't fit. What was real Islam? It has been lost at this time. And so if you take away the black stone and take away Mecca, then what direction do you pray? And where do you go for pilgrimage? And what do you do? And so slowly this whole thing fizzled out and disappeared. But the Karmatians are a very interesting, very late argument. I mean, several centuries later, but still fighting and trying to bring back the original Islam.
And so, Dan, Karmatians have often been seen as reformers in and of themselves because they're bringing in Greek philosophy and other elements, but you actually see them as sort of this last surge of traditionalism.
The last bit of it, and I don't think they even had the traditional story all correct, because people have been rewriting Islamic history down, and not inventing huge things, but it had all been changed, and it wasn't clear by that time really what the original Islam is. And I think that today we have the same problem. We no longer know what Muhammad exactly taught. We don't know what it looks like because it has been changed so many times over history, just little bits and pieces. Hajjaj being the main guy, who I would accuse of really influencing and not only rebranding, but just changing a lot of little things in Islam. Okay, from here on, that's sort of where we finished up our whole argument about what we looked at and what the stones are saying. But at this point, we had people come along and argue against us. So the next couple chapters deal with some of the arguments that people made against what we have said and what was written in some of the previous books. And people have come along. So some of these needed to be addressed simply because they're substantial. The first one is Dr. King came along and he wrote a lot of stuff. This was very interesting. Chad came and said, I'd like to write this chapter on Dr. King. I'm like, please do. Because I really didn't know how do I do it, because Dr. King has come across very strongly against me. And so I didn't want to come back very strongly. I wasn't wanting to write a book of all his arguments versus my arguments. That's not what I wanted to do. I think his arguments, as we look at them, the first question is, what are his arguments? Because it's really hard to try to figure out. And Chad said he'd tackle that. So Chad, what did you find?
Yeah, one of the issues when Dr. David A. King, first introduce him, because if you've been following Dan's work, you may have caught signs of this already, that there's been some discourse. You've addressed him in a series of videos. Dr. David A. King, I just want to get it right. He has a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Literatures, and then he has a BA and an MA in mathematics. And he became sort of one of the forerunner of developing medieval Islamic astronomy, studying the manuscripts, because he had a great mix of degrees for that. That was right in his wheelhouse,
Yep.
and he was the leader in that field. And as that sort of morphed into archaeoastronomy, I believe through the 70s, he was writing papers in that field as well. And he does a lot of work and is very well respected in terms of later medieval Islamic astronomy, archaeoastronomy, and those sorts of things. Now, where Dr. King and Dan Gibson have sort of butt heads a little bit is when Dr. King also recognizes that the early mosques of Islam don't face in the directions that we traditionally believe they should. He doesn't dispute that point at all. In fact, at one point in his manuscript, he even says they do appear to face Mecca, but he would say do appear to face Petra,
Right.
but he would say for other reasons. What Dr. King believes is that while these mosques do not face Mecca in the geographical sense, they align to the Kaaba and Mecca in astronomical ways. And so this may involve aligning to certain stars, taking certain parameters that the Kaaba takes, aligning to the cardinal directions, aligning to different winds that are found in different manuscripts, a little bit abstract, but they're also assigned to the Kaaba by medieval writers.
Now, did he make these up, or did he find these in ancient writings?
he found them, but one of the criticisms I have of Dr. King's explanation for all these different Qiblas is we found, I think, over 20 different modes of alignment. And he almost has enough modes of alignment as he has different Qiblas that he studies, because he doesn't go in great depth with every Qibla.
But Dr. King didn't invent these. He found them in writings written by the medieval writers. They're writing, some of them 500-600 years later or more, and that's like down in Yemen. Somebody said, well, what about the four winds? And we look at the winds that blow on the Kaaba building, so when somebody built a mosque, maybe they used one of these winds, because they're trying to explain what happened in those first years.
They're noticing the same issue, and they're trying to fill in those gaps. So it's an honest explanation, and Dr. King has adopted it.
Yeah, that's the part that I struggled with, is that he seems to accept some of these explanations that were given later, and he goes back and tries to defend them all and looking at various mosques.
Right. And so what I try to do in this chapter is I identify his major arguments against Dan. I sort of try to explain exactly what Dr. King is saying, and it's become difficult because I had written the first version of this chapter based on a number of papers he's written over the past couple decades I read, and then he released a monograph which was over 1,300 pages long. And if you're wondering about the subject matter, I did a Control-F search for the name Gibson in this monograph, which appeared over 1,700 times. So suddenly Dan and I had a whole lot of work to do. I read most of the monograph and rewrote the entire chapter. I don't want to be uncharitable to Dr. King, but Dr. King has been uncharitable to you, and so we need to firmly refute some of his arguments. And I think we can do that fairly well.
And what we're trying to do is refute the theory that he's presenting, and he never comes out and clearly states that theory. He always dances around and we're trying to figure out what do these words mean that he's actually presenting. Because rather than go back and argue on every individual mosque, we just need to know what is the basic theory that Dr. King says this is how they aligned mosques. And he has almost as many methods of aligning mosques as he has theory. As he has mosques. He can go back and look at any mosque and go, oh, if you're standing at the Kaaba, the certain star is there, and we're standing here, and the certain star is there. So that works for this mosque. You go over to another mosque, oh, here they use the cardinal direction on this side, or they use this. And so it becomes very hard to deal with. You can't address every mosque. And he goes through his book. He's trying to address a lot of different mosques, and some of it's interesting, but it's the general thrust of what is he presenting. And in the end, I had to just shake my head and realize, what is Dr. King saying? And Dr. King theologically is saying that God told Muhammad in Surah chapter 2 that I've seen you, in your prayers, and now I'm going to give you a Qibla, a direction of prayer that will please you. And then he says, you're supposed to face Masjid al-Haram when you pray. And so that's very nice if you're standing in Petra and Masjid al-Haram is right there or just over the next valley. You know which direction to pray. But what happens when you're miles and miles and miles away? And Dr. King's answer, his conclusion is they didn't know how to face anything over the horizon. And so he says they just did their best. They just looked at things. And it wasn't until, and here he quotes an early mathematician in Islam, he said it's not until they smelled the sweet fragrance of mathematics that they actually figured it out. And then they could do it because they had spherical trigonometry and they could figure out where things were over the horizon using the stars and using spherical trigonometry. Well, my problem with that is theologically that means that for the first 300 years of Islamic history, Muslims didn't know which way to pray. God asked them to do something and they didn't know how to do it, and they just went out and made a mess of it. And that's sort of the way I interpret what I read from Dr. King. And I can't accept that as logical, and I don't think the early Muslims thought that either. And when we look at it and use the Indian circle method, we see there is logic and there is direction and everything else. So Dr. King and I have clashed over this, and that's the chapter that deals with it.
Yes, if you want greater detail on that, there's lots to eat up there. You can feel free to look at the chapter and see how we make our case.
And Dr. King's book is free of charge. You can go and download it, and you can read all those hundreds and hundreds of pages and see what he has to say. From here on, another argument that was given to me was, where were the Romans? I mean, Petra is in the Byzantine Empire, so how could Islam develop there? And weren't there laws against the pagans that were going on? And so the whole thing is, well, it can't be in Petra because there was a Byzantine Roman presence there. And so Chad, having a background in history and a love for Roman history and Byzantine history, said, I'd like to take this one on too. So I said, go for it, because that's an area you know a lot. I've gathered all the books. Here you go, Chad. Have a read.
Yeah, there were a number of different directions I took in trying to counter that argument, or answer that argument more than a counter, because it's a great argument. How do you have this militia religion building up within Byzantine territory? I'll call them Romans. I call them Romans in the book. That's kind of the trend now, but that's the way I'll go about it. What I started with is a scholar named Mariana Castro did this incredible study on the Roman border fortifications in Arabia Petrea, which was the province around Petra, and sort of phase by phase watched the ways they moved and changed. And what we find is by the Byzantine times, the later Roman times, that's not quite later Roman, but by that time frame, there were much fewer fortifications, and they were less heavily fortified, and they had moved well past the Jordan Valley. They had moved well past Petra, and were on the east side of the escarpment from Petra on the plateau. And so I brought this up because it shows us that the Roman military presence in and around Petra at the time of Muhammad would have been very thin. It wouldn't have been a major part of their life because they were already by that time quite far from the fortifications, and the fortifications were mostly watchtowers. So I found that really interesting. It wasn't like we imagine on the Rhine with these large garrisons of tens and thousands of troops ready for a German invasion. And Mariana Castro explains well that that's a misconception we have.
So who were the Roman soldiers?
Yeah, that was the next thing I explored, because these aren't the soldiers of Holy Rome with their crested helmets and red capes. What I found by examining historical sources available to us is a huge portion of Roman troops in the region were Confederates. They were Ghassanid Confederates who were Christian Arabs from the north. And in fact, operating in the region, if you know your Roman history around there, the Romans relied on the Ghassanids for all of their military operations in the region. When it came to local garrisons, they would often hire local men. And so we can say that the majority of Roman soldiers along this thinly fortified Roman line were Arabs. So not only do we not have a lot of soldiers around, but Muhammad may have known a number of them. They may have been family members. You never know.
Right. So then, how did the Battle of Muta take place, and who was there?
Oh, yeah. I'll get to that in a second.
Okay, go ahead.
I pick up on one other thread, and that's Petra from, or it's this argument that, but the emperors had declared that no pagan worship was permitted within the empire.
I got several emails on this.
Right.
They couldn't have been in Petra because there was this edicts.
It's a total misconception to believe that an edict from the emperor would suddenly change the entire population of the empire. And we know this is simply because they had to do it 2 more times, right? The edict didn't stick. And we have missionary records from even in the countryside outside of Constantinople saying that monks were converting tens of thousands of pagans there in the 5th and 6th century. And that's in the heartland of the Christian Roman Empire at the time. So on the very fringes of the empire, where we know that they were often sending heretics, we have records of them sending heretics specifically to Petra. One became a bishop. There's no reason to believe that pagan worship wasn't happening there. And we know that in other areas of the empire, in Egypt and Syria, it was happening. In mainland Greece, it was happening till the 9th century. So.
And the archaeology stands this out that there were both pagan and Christians in the city of Petra.
And that happened for a long time. So the edicts were there. I'm sure the church in Petra was annoyed that the Quraysh were doing this worship, but like many other places, it was an unenforceable edict. So now what I looked at last, sort of to really answer the question in its fullest, if you want to know how Islam was able to grow and spread and militarize within the Roman Empire, it's because Petra was not in the Roman Empire when Islam was exploding.
Really? And I thought it was in the Byzantine era, in the area.
It was, but you may know about the disastrous Sasanian Roman War, which dragged on for a long time. The Romans lost vast stretches of territory, including Jerusalem, ultimately including all of Egypt. And, of course, Petra was influenced by this. It fell outside of Roman control. And so we set up a timeline in the book comparing some of the developments of Islam and some of the developments in the Roman...
Yeah, there's a nice chart with what's happening in the Byzantine world and what's happening in the Muslim world and seeing them fit together.
They line up. And if you think we're just making this up, you can look in the Quran, and one of the few explicit historical references is to the fact that the Romans are losing the war, which tells us this directly impacted the lives of the Muslims. Why would it be such a big deal all the way down in Saudi Arabia?
Well, they were both people of the book.
They were both people of the book, yeah.
So there would be, they're feeling this thing. Yep, that's all there. So, my question then is, what happened if the Byzantines are gone? Then how did the Battle of Mu'tah take place?
It's really interesting. If you're familiar with the Battle of Mu'tah, you know the numbers get really out of hand. There's more soldiers there than in the entire empire, and Heraclius is there for some reason. But if you look at the Roman sources, it's a lot more subdued. A Qurayshi informant tells the Romans, hey, the Muslims are coming this way. They're going to raid into your territory. I was reading the historian Walter Kagi. He's was one of the leading Byzantine historians, and he makes the argument that the Muslims are fighting at Mu'tah because they are opposing the Byzantines, the Romans, as they are crossing back over the Jordan, trying to reassert themselves over the territories they had lost.
So the Romans are coming down, taking over their old territory.
Taking over their old territory, and for some reason, Muhammad doesn't want that, even though they're mutual people of the book. They're looked on favorably in the Quran. Why are they fighting? What if I could sit down with Walter Kagi, I would ask him, why?
Right.
Why, if and it's right at this time that Muhammad sends his force out to oppose the Byzantines at Mu'tah. He loses, they get a bloody nose, and he very shortly thereafter, that same year, seizes the holy city. Because we believe he is desperate to keep Petra out of the hands of the Byzantines. He wants to establish his holy city.
Right, and as the Roman army has been pushed back by the Sassanids, you see this vacuum, and this is where Muhammad comes in, and this is where he's preaching, and a lot of the things that are going on. It's important to see what's actually happening in history and fit the Islamic history in, and it fits together very, very nicely.
It also explains why the Quraysh are gloating about the Byzantines losing to the Sasanians, because the Quraysh now can fill the power vacuum. They have their position back, they have their esteem back, and they have a free hand to persecute the Muslims.
That's right. So it's a very interesting chapter, fascinating chapter on the Roman army and how they influenced the Islamic world and how the Islamic world influenced the Roman world. So fascinating. Then we go to the last chapter, and it's kind of a collective all. We've had a lot of arguments about locations. What about this? What about that? And people brought this up. So we just shoved those all in the last chapter, and there's a whole bunch of these. And we start out with Abraha and the elephant. How does that story fit? And we have a little look to see that Abraha was an actual person, and he actually did go raiding into Arabia. We have that much, but we don't have an actual step-by-step account in secular history, but we have that in Islamic history of what happened. And so we look at Abraha. He's really there. And we look at something that you should pick up as you go through this, the change of the effects of climate change during this time, because there is a period of years in which people now, scientists now going back are saying during this period there was rapid climate change in Arabia. We're not the first ones facing rapid climate change. It happened back then in Arabia, and a lot of deserts developed just over a 100-year period. Just see this massive developing. How did that influence Islam? Why did all these young men leave their disappearing villages and go off and join the armies and go off to fight? So a lot is taking place back there. Abraha's story is before that desert expanded, and so back then it was a lot of grassland as he marched his elephant up to which we believe is the city of Petra.
Yeah, and the archaeology once again bears out this climate change, because there are cities in the middle of the desert that are totally untenable, no water sources, that used to have industry and agriculture.
And these date back to just around the time of the founding of Islam and during the early years of Islam, and now they're just in the desert. So, yeah, fascinating. Then we look at the Battle of Badr. Where was that? This is the very first attack that was a military attack of Muslims against the Quraysh, who were getting their arms from the Christians. So where did that take place? Traditionally, people say it took place in Saudi Arabia, and we look at those accounts and see why they're basically untenable, why there's big questions about them, and then we look at a location up in Jordan which fits that description and ask the question, is this where the Battle of Badr took place? It needs more study, it needs more work. As far as reading, the names on the tombstones are very faded. I've made 2 attempts of trying to get good photographs of them, and very difficult. The wording is really faded on these things, and so it would be good for somebody to really do that, because we have the names of the people who died at Badr, especially the Muslims and some of the polytheists. But stuff has been standing now for over 1,000 years, and at a tombstone that's been blasted by sand over 1,000 years, sandstorms.
Yeah.
I mean, it is really faded. It's very difficult. From there on, we moved to China. China, I had a chance to go to China years ago. I went and looked at one mosque that was there. I wasn't really aware of the China story.
Yeah, that story has actually been continuing to develop. And where is it at now when it comes to China? It's very interesting.
I wish we had academic papers, but the scholars in China have not been encouraged by the Chinese government. And so these scholars, especially those of Chinese descent, mostly go back to the some written accounts, but some of them verbal accounts that they've had, just the oral accounts that have come down to them of how Islam reached China and how it reached China during the lifetime of Muhammad. That's very fascinating. And so we have a look at that and some of the things that they say and why there is this thought in China among the Muslims who are reading their history that the founding of Islam was not in Mecca, but was northwest of Mecca. And so that is in some of the things that's reading that we can read back and look at. So China is a very interesting.
Yeah, and you're in correspondence with this Chinese Muslim historian who is insisting that Dan change the local mosque to Petra facing because that is the local tradition.
Yeah. Although he doesn't know it as Petra, he just said it's not Mecca. We know it's west of Mecca. Okay, so that was China. We touch on that. We then look at Medina, because everyone says, well, what about Medina? Is Medina where Medina is supposed to be? And the answer is yes, I think it is. No question. And we go back. I mean, it's very easy. You go to Medina, you find the places, you find the locations. But there are some challenges, like the Battle of the Ditch. Why did they put the ditch across northern part of Medina to keep away the attacking Quraysh army when Mecca's in the south? And so why did they defend themselves? Because if the Quraysh were in Mecca, they would have attacked from the south. Well, here they put their defenses all in the north, and we believe that's because Petra's up north. The Quraysh were there, and they came down. So we look a little bit at Medina and some of the things we can learn about early Islam. Then comes the question of Paran.
Yeah, Paran or Paran. In biblical geography, it's an important region that features into the history of the Hebrew people, and it's something that also comes up in Islamic history, but there is a little bit of a traditional uncertainty about where that is, and it's being shifted all over the place. But you make a great case with some of your background study about where Paran actually is, and then connecting it to the documents which sort of suggest that that was the birthplace of Islam.
Yeah, and looking at what do Muslim historians say where it is. And so it's an important thing to put together because it helps support the Petra argument as well. Another question that has come up is, what about Taif? Taif is an early city near to Mecca. And so everybody just says, well, Taif is close to Mecca down in Saudi Arabia, so it couldn't have been Petra. It's a good argument, unless the city of Petra has been moved, or Mecca was moved, and the city of Taif has been moved. You must somehow, so has Taif moved as well? And how did that work? And so I went back and looked at the descriptions of Taif, and just looking at what altars were there, what temples were there, and the temple of Alat was there. Alat was never worshipped down in Central Arabia. There's not even inscriptions about her or anything like that. She was worshipped in a place called Wadi Rum, and there is a place there, and you go look at it, and I started to take the descriptions of early Taif with Wadi Rum and realizing, hey, these things seem to fit together. So I made this suggestion, without knowing any more, that perhaps that city had moved down. Not until we were actually working on this did it suddenly, I found some early writings about Taif, and early Muslims were saying Taif was a city that moved. And it moved from up in Palestine all the way down to beside Mecca. And so it's almost written like it magically moved down. Allah moved the city down, you know. But of course, if the people just move themselves down and to where Taif is today, then that would be true. So there are hints in Islamic history that this city actually moved from the north down to the south, just as I put together earlier in my thinking.
Oh, it's interesting. The last Roman province that Petra was in was Palestina, Tertia.
Yeah.
I just never call it that because then everybody thinks I'm talking about Palestine.
Right. And so... yeah, and so when people say, oh, it's from Palestine, you think, oh, it's up north. No, it was in the right place. Okay, what about Zamzam? What do you think? Why? How could they move Zamzam? That's the question I get.
Yeah, well, how do you move Zamzam? A well is a well, isn't that part of it?
That's part of it, but imagine if there's two wells, a well in the old town and a well in the new city. So do you move the well, or you just move the name? You simply move the name, and it's just renamed it. So eventually people, as they arrived down in Mecca and Saudi Arabia, the Black Rock was there, and so eventually people, probably not very long, could have been months, maybe a year, but everybody realized the Black Rock is here. We should go see it. And so people would go and see it. And so you started already a little pilgrimage happening and people going, and then people are going to get water from the well. Oh, this is Zamzam, you know. And so suddenly the thing just morphed over to this was the holy city. And so they went around. By the time 600 years have passed, you have got people like... a Yakut coming along and going around and identifying places and writing it down, and by that time it had solidified everything. They knew exactly where everything was, because some of these guys had gone around to rediscover where all these places were located.
And unfortunately, in this case, when it comes to Petra, you're not really able to go and say, oh, there's Zamzam, because, you know, it's well known Petra has dealt with a lot of flooding and sediment, and there's even records in the Islamic sources that Zamzam had been lost at different points in history.
That's right. And the records tell us there were 10 wells in the original city. And if you go to Petra, you were able to find some of those wells. You go to Mecca and you don't. Everybody's just got one well, Zamzam. So, interesting things. Another place was called Shib Abu Talib, and that's a canyon. As you read the story, Muhammad and his followers are blocked into this, what I would call a box canyon. A canyon is it's a valley, very steep sides, goes in, but then it stops. It doesn't go anywhere. And so they were in there, and they almost starved to death. And people had to smuggle some food in, and so forth. And so this is described in Mecca. You can go in Saudi Arabia and see, here's Shib Abu Talib, and I looked at it, and it's a valley with just, they could have walked out at any point, and right now there's houses up over the side and around and stuff,
Right,
and
yeah.
it doesn't fit. But when it comes to Petra, immediately I thought, I think I know where this is. There's a place near Petra that is a box canyon, and it's full of the carvings, and mostly houses carved in the side of the rocks, because it's cliff inside and cliffs all the way around. And so once you're in there, you could easily be held in there by just a couple of men, because it also has a very narrow entrance, really not much wider. It's very hard to get a horse in there or a camel, because they basically scrape the sides going in. So, I mean, it's there, and we've got pictures of it and descriptions. I think we can easily find that in Petra. Much better location that fits that than down in Mecca.
But, critics have often pointed out there's not a history of Islamic structure in and around Petra. There should be something. What does Shib Abu Talib have to do with that?
Well, it's interesting because there's been the Al-Baida Islamic project, because as they were looking and digging, archaeologists have started examining the area right outside of this canyon, right at the mouth of the canyon, and what do they find? 2 mosques right there, early mosques. And so there was an Islamic presence there going way back, and so that's something that they will continue to write and look at, but the presence of Islam seems to have been outside of Petra more than right down into the core.
And this needs time to develop, but you can already start to imagine that if this was commonly understood as the home of Muhammad, having 2 mosques right there only seems appropriate.
Yep. And so let's move on. There's Ghadr Kum. This is the place where agreements were signed between people, and it's described as a place where there was some water and different things. And so where was that in Mecca, and where was that in Saudi, up in Petra, from Saudi to Petra? So we have a look at, and there's a number of places that could be possible, and I suggest a possibility there, but it's not like it's impossible to fit, but without further study and without really doing a lot of work, we can't say absolutely this is the spot, but it is possible. And lastly, we look at Al-Abwa, which is the place where Muhammad's mother was from. The descriptions of Al-Abwa, and we look at, there's one down in Saudi Arabia. You go there and they'll even tell you, and here is the tomb of Al-Abwa. Unfortunately,
Of Amina.
Yes, of Amina. Sorry, yeah, thank you. And when you look at it, though, it doesn't fit the descriptions. Hers is supposed to be like in a valley, and this is on top of a mountain. I mean, that's the first one. It's like, it can't be the same place. So it's just, people have been going around trying to fit the story into Saudi Arabia, come up to Petra, and then we find places that fit the story there. So just to answer some of the questions that had come up at the end. So lastly, we have a chapter, a conclusion, looking at what are some of the things we learn? What are some of the things we're asking people to accept? And we're asking people to accept that there were different Qiblas. We're asking people to accept just how they determined those Qiblas, and if they used the Indian method and did that work. We're asking people to accept the language around Petra, and that Petra, the name and the language and everything, fits into the story. We're asking people to fit this whole thing about the religion of Abraham and the founding of it and why that's important. And the Roman history. And just a conclusion at the end. What are some of the challenges anyone reading this has got to face? Then we move into the appendices.
Yeah, the appendices are pretty substantial, aren't they?
They are, and there's a lot that we stick into the appendices. First of all, the Qibla database. The database is not big and heavy. We list mosques in chronological order. We list dates of when they were built. Some of them, it's down to 100 years, and somewhere in there, some of them we can nail the date right down because of an inscription on them. Or some other method. And we've got the town, the country, and the GPS coordinates. So you can go down and look at that. Really, if you want to get in and study this, go to the internet, use the Kibble tool, because it gives you links and you can go and expand that and get into everything else. But for somebody who doesn't have the Kibble tool, it's like a spreadsheet and it's printed out in the back of the book.
Yeah, the next part's a little bit more substantial with the mosque.
Yeah, then we go into the mosque. Now, if you remember early Islamic Qiblas, I did one mosque per page. I mean, now with 270 some mosques, that would be over 270 pages, and we didn't want to go there. So what I did is simply show a picture, generally, if I have one, of the mosque, and a little bit about the data, a few lines introducing what this is. If you want to know more, go to the Kibble tool, find the mosque, and then when you click on it, you can click on further information over on the bottom right hand side, and that'll open up a page, because we have a web page on each one of these mosques, and you can go in and examine it. So from there, then we had some more information. The whole time we're doing this, stuff keeps getting added. I mean, there's no end. And we have to just say, now we're going to publish this book. Okay, stuff keeps coming in.
Probably today there's more we would add if we could, but you have to stop.
Right, so I mean, Dr. Schum and Goldstein have sent another paper in that they wrote. So I said, well, we've already got everything done. I'm going to stick it in the appendices. So you can go and read their thing in the appendices that they have on testing the Qiblas.
Yeah, and this time they pay more particular attention to Dr. King's arguments and get into that a little more. If you want to see more evidence on how Dan's argument, when tested, fares better than Dr. King's.
And around this time as well, Peter Haramos, who's a statistician and has done a lot in the area of statistics and has published peer-reviewed papers in many different locations, well respected as a mathematician. He wrote a paper, and it's a very large paper, but he was had a thesis he was putting forward, and one of the examples he uses of how this works is he used the Petra data and to apply his thesis to, and it's very interesting. So I mentioned that here. I have a couple of paragraphs and tell you where you can go and see that, because he's using just a bunch of stuff in mathematics I can't explain. You go look at it. But how you can see a pattern, I would describe it as a pattern like a shot of a shotgun. When you shoot, what's that big pattern out there? And say, well, where was the guy aiming? And so quickly they can look at it and put it down and say, this is where he's aiming. So we've got this. He does it with Petra, and the circle comes right around Petra. Very nice. There's the mosque, but that's where they were aiming. He does it with the between Qibla, and he says, there's the shotgun pattern. Here's all the mosques. But what were they aiming at? And he said, they're aiming right there. And what's interesting is he went and looked to see what's right there, because I didn't have it right there. I had it 60 kilometers away over here, because I had just drawn a circle around.
Yeah, you were eyeballing it.
I eyeballed it up. Here's a circle. There it is. I'm about 60 kilometers
away. We're not
away.
the math guys.
He's got all the math, and he goes, well, yeah, that is in the center of the circle, but really the center is there. And right at that spot is an ancient Nabatean temple. And more than just an ancient Nabatean temple, it's an unexplained ancient Nabatean temple with a well beside it and nothing else. And so you can go and read the paper. And so new stuff is coming out all the time. Now, before you get all excited, there isn't a lot more information than that. I'm just giving you the brief, and the paper goes in all the detail of how he located that spot. Yeah. So, and since then, I've had another guy write in, and he said, here's what I'm doing and how I would like to approach it statistically. And so there's another paper in the works. And I said, well, it's very nice what you did about mine. Can you please try the same formulas that you're using on my statistics on Dr. King? Now, that's a lot harder, because Dr. King doesn't give us a lot of solid stuff that we can work with mathematically. So he's going to try it, looking at the different mosques and seeing if we can do the same thing with Dr. King's data to see if it makes any sense. So more stuff is going on all the time. It's not like this has ended, even though I'm getting older and I would like to draw my just involvement in all of this more to a conclusion and step away a little bit and have a chance to take a rest from this topic for a while. But at the end is the bibliography, and that wasn't I helped with this. That was Chad's baby. Chad, you had to look up all of the references and check them out.
It's my job. It wasn't my most fun, but it felt good when it was done.
Right. Now, what the challenge is, there's 226 references. I remember some of them, and since then I've had a couple emails, people who are reading the free book because it's out for free, who have asked about one of the references, and I realized, oh yeah, we had some challenges there, and I can't remember what they were. You don't know about this. Yeah, it's Wakiti, and which Wakiti did we use? Because there's several different manuscripts, and so we'll have to go back and have a chat about that, because what I'm trying to do now is on the website at the top of nabatea.net, you can explore and you can go visit things, you can shop, but you can also read. And if you click the read tab, the only thing I've got under there now is you can go read the bibliography of this book. And I'm trying to put links either to where you buy the book, if it's for sale, or you can actually read the paper if it's an older paper and it's available public domain. And so I've got about halfway through that at this point, and I still got to work on that, trying to make the references available to people. So if you're reading through this, the references are actually more important than a lot of the other stuff in the book, because the question is, where did you get this from? Who said this? And that's what the reference is about. You can check it out. And if you are really doubting what we're saying, please check the references. Go to that. That is a lot of work went into putting that part together.
Yeah, we did the best we could to make sure it was well documented. I'm sure I did maybe some little mistake somewhere, but as long as the heart of what we're doing, we're upfront, honest, and we can show people where our arguments are coming from, yeah. I think it just strengthens the whole project. Yeah.
And I'm a big picture guy. Detail is hard. So often I make little mistakes in detail. That's where you've had to come along and double check everything that I wrote. Oh yeah, that's in here, and then I find it. Oh no, actually, we gave the wrong page number or something. I don't know how I end up introducing errors somehow into this stuff. So as you found, we're trying to be honest. We're not making up references. They're there. We just have to pull them out. So please have a look at that. That's the table of contents, and you have an idea of what's in the book. Now you can go out and get it, download it off of nabatea.net. That's on the bottom of the screen. Or you can go to amazon.com or other places. Look for the book. It's not out in print yet. When we're recording this, it may be out in print by the time you're watching this. So thank you. I'm Dan Gibson, and this is Chad, and we enjoyed doing this talk with you.
Take care.